Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second EPRS Policy Roundtable of this new year, 2022. Last week, the European Parliamentary Research Service, through 10 of its policy analysts, looked at 10 issues to watch in the coming year from the EU's point of view in terms of policy challenges and choices which the European Union would face. And today we're moving across the Atlantic and looking at the United States. And the subject of our seminar is President Biden's second year. What will 2022 bring in US politics? Thank you so much for joining us for this event. We're currently 85 participants online and hopefully more in due course. And to answer that question, we are joined by 6 distinguished think tankers and panelists, and indeed also Joe Dunne, the head of the Washington office of the European Parliament. And our distinguished panel comprises Fran BURWELL, a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council, Elaine, Senior Fellow in Government Studies at the Brookings Institution, Jakob Funk KIRKEGAARD, who is a Senior Fellow both of the German Marshall Fund in Brussels and the Peterson Institute in Washington, DC, Bruce Stokes, Director of the Transatlantic Task Force at the German Marshall Fund and previously with the Pew Research Center, David Winston, who is President of the eponymous Winston Group, which is a leading polling organization in the United States, Leslie VINJAMURI, Director of the US and Americas Program at Chatham House in London, and last but not least, Joe Dunne from our Washington office. So what are we really talking about? Well, we could have done this on President Biden's first term, and there were a number of seminars from various think tanks in the last few weeks on that very subject. And the first year was had its successes and its disappointments. The principal successes were a 1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan and a 1 trillion Infrastructure Investment Act. But of course, there was also the major and really confidence shaking foreign policy crisis surrounding America's rather chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. The president's Build Back Better bill is currently stalled in the US Congress, where divisions among the Democrats who enjoy the narrowest of possible advantages in the Senate, which is 50-50 and decided by the casting vote of the vice president, and only an 8-seat majority in the House of Representatives, those divisions seem to be becoming, at least from the point of view of outside observers, increasingly intractable. And the US economy shows mixed signals, with low unemployment down at only 3.9%, but a high and rising inflation rate of around 7%, and obviously some uncertainty about the trajectory of the economy over the coming 12 months. And all of this, of course, set against the worrying backdrop of big geopolitical changes, the rise of China, the growing belligerence of Russia, not least in Ukraine, more generally on the world stage, and the complex challenges that still remain of rolling out and managing to get a control on the coronavirus crisis through the vaccination strategy and other techniques. So these all provide hugely complex and problematic backdrops for the president as he faces his second year. That year is effectively bookended earlier than the end of December on the 8th of November 2022, when the US midterm elections will take place and the prospect that the Democrats might lose their majority. That is a common assumption at the moment, although it's still many months away, and as we all know, politics is full of unexpected and big surprises. So one question which I know the panel will want to talk about is what difference that result might make and which way it's likely to go. The difference it might make to Biden's capacity to deliver during the remainder of his 2 years in office, and the two main parties' chances as they prepare the ground for the 2024 presidential election. Does Donald Trump's continued prominence and presence in American politics help or hinder the Republicans, either in the midterms or in the presidential elections 2 years later? And how does the American economy now look at the economy and its performance as the key determinant, or otherwise, in the way that they are likely to vote at the midterm elections? These and many other issues, including foreign policy questions about how our transatlantic relations shaping up, is the moment of opportunity which Biden's presidential victory appeared to offer to the EU and the US being taken advantage of. Some of the issues that are going to be now ventilated and discussed fully as a result of our excellent panel. And I'm going to invite them to come in really in alphabetical order to give their views on these and many other questions, anything which they think really is important in the context of the second full year in office of President Joe Biden. And to get the ball rolling and to give us hopefully a flying start, I'd like to go over to Fran BURWELL, who's a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council, where she directs its Transatlantic Digital Marketplace Initiative. She's previously been a vice president of the Atlantic Council and also directed its Transatlantic program. She previously headed up the Center for International Security Studies at the University of Maryland and was founding director of Women in International Security. So, Fran, what is your take on Biden's second year?
Well, Anthony, thanks very much for inviting me for this. I think that, first off, to talk about the second year, one does have to go back to the first year, because I do think that it's hard to judge where they're going to go. Particularly, we are at a particular moment where there is a huge, major question when it comes to foreign policy, and that's Russia-Ukraine. And it's very hard to see, until we have a little bit more data, shall we say, it's very hard to see what impact that is going to have on the Biden administration and its foreign policy. Let me say a couple of things about the past year and the goals or philosophy of the Biden administration in foreign policy. First off, this is, to my recollection, one of the most experienced and teams in terms of foreign policy, and one that I think is perhaps the most compatible with the transatlantic relationship. These are people who, for the most part, have been in government before, either during previous previous Democratic administrations or in some other way as a nonpartisan. So they know the drill. But the big problem has been that it's taken forever to get people into place. The fact that we only now have our ambassador to the EU in place is just not something that I think any of us would have predicted at the beginning of this administration. But here we are. I think when you look at the Biden administration and what they intended to do when they came into office, I would say the top goals that I see were rebuild alliances, not just transatlantic, but that maybe had first priority. Get out of Afghanistan. That was clear to anyone who listened to the campaign. But I think, you know, you made some very good comments about the way it's been perceived and will be used to say that the Biden administration is weak as we head towards the midterm elections. Predictable, stable relationship with Russia, we're not quite there yet. And then meeting the Chinese challenge, both economic, social and political, and military. But I want to underscore two things. One is the view of the world that comes directly from the president, I think. And that is that we are at a particular moment of a clash between authoritarianism and democracies. One can distinguish between authoritarian countries. You shouldn't put them all in one basket. But it does also mirror the challenge that he sees in our national politics. You heard him frequently say a fight for the soul of the nation when he was campaigning. Secondly is the idea of foreign policy for the middle classes. I would say that there's been a lot of discussion in Washington about what this exactly means, but it's certainly not isolationism, but it is a step-by-step evaluation of relationships and of policies to see how they benefit from how the middle class in the United States and the working classes might benefit or might not benefit from them. And I think this has had its biggest, most direct impact in trade policy, but not only there. I think democracy is an element of that. So I cannot say that the administration has done incredibly well in all of these, achieving all these goals. And I've left out climate and rejoining the Iran talks and things like that. But I think some interesting points emerge, particularly, and let me focus now on a couple of points with Russia and then the transatlantic partnership and where they're going. First off, one of the interesting things to me about all the administration rhetoric about the current Ukraine crisis is that it has kept open the option of continuing negotiations with Russia. And in fact, going back in the current back and forth, you do see an opening for a resumption of something like the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, and some of the things that this particular group of policymakers, I think, feels is very stabilizing in the relationship, even as Russia's behavior is very destabilizing. So trying to keep that door open and trying to use it as leverage to de-escalate the current crisis. So it will be interesting to see how that plays out. I do think that there are questions to be asked about the rhetoric here on this side, which is considerably stronger and more alarmist than it is in much of Europe. But it's hard to know whether that's tactical or something else. On the Transatlantic Partnership, I think we have gotten off to actually a very good start. We've done the basics, reaffirmed NATO and Article 5. Airbus Boeing has been parked over on the side of the runway, so to speak. We have international taxes. We don't know if it's going to be, everyone's going to do what they need to do, but it's an important step forward from what was becoming a very bad dispute. Steel and aluminum, the same thing, and an opportunity to talk about green steel together. Perhaps most importantly, in an odd way, is the establishment of the Trade and Technology Council. It's not something that we should place the entire Transatlantic Partnership on, because the goals are going to be very limited. Information sharing and getting rid or avoiding the inadvertent trade conflicts. And that's where I think, we need to look as we think about the future and this next year. Depending upon what happens with Russia and Ukraine, there are kind of two options. One is we do end up in a real shooting war, not between NATO and Russia, but between Russia and Ukraine, but with NATO support. We therefore end up in sort of a proxy conflict. That will dominate everything over the next year, absolutely everything, and particularly US relations with the rest of Europe. It will privilege NATO in many ways, understandably. And it will also mean that many other issues get pushed aside. Let's assume that doesn't happen. Let's assume there's a de-escalation. Then I think the focus moves in the relationship more to the trade and tech side, as well as climate. I will put that in there, but I think that we have a number of specific issues that are going to come up. First off, one of the things that has already been learned is the importance of consultation. I think AUKUS was a real wake-up call for the administration, and it speaks to the tendency of US administrations to compartmentalize, i.e., this is about the Indo-Pacific. What does Europe have to do with the Indo-Pacific? And we know that the Europeanists in the White House argue that they should be more involved in this decision, and we're beaten back. And the president ended up apologizing to President Macron. So I think that we are going to see more or less compartmentalization, but it is a tendency in US foreign policy anyway, because we have such a huge agenda. If the agenda shifts and we don't have this if we don't have a conflict going on, a couple of issues that I see coming up. First is strategic autonomy. This administration, I think, was in the beginning very tolerant of European statements on strategic autonomy, working to get an association agreement with the European Defense Agency and things like this. I think the recent statements of President Macron and the privileging that he has done of this particular issue have raised some alarms. In part, it's the timing, but it's also just not wanting to be challenged in this way. And we can speak more about it in terms of in the Q&A. But there's a understanding here of European need, desire to boost its capabilities. And if strategic autonomy does that, great. But there's also a concern that things won't be as interoperable with NATO as they should be. And when you transfer this over into the economic and digital realm, it becomes, yes, we want Europe to develop its digital capabilities, but we don't want it to be protectionist in nature. So that whole rhetorical angle will come to play a bigger role this coming year. we have a whole bunch of very specific regulatory potential conflicts. DMA, which is moving towards finalization very quickly. Potentially DSA, I think a lot of the hiccups of a lot of the issues have been worked out, but it depends how these are implemented. The AI Act, data governance, we're still waiting for the Data Act to come out. And we don't have a resolution yet of the data transfers issue, which is becoming increasingly challenging as some of the data protection supervisors in Europe actually try to stop data transfers. We also have an emerging issue, which we're seeing first in France, but it won't stop there, where US cloud providers are being restricted because of the US Cloud Act, which requires US-based companies to provide data even from servers that are not in the United States. On sustainability, let me just point to one issue that everyone's being very nice about now, and that's CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. But we don't have a price for carbon in the United States. And so this is going to be a very, very tricky issue as we move forward. I think the key issue, and I'm going to end with this, is kind of one of expectations and mutually different expectations. The EU is moving ahead with its legislation, and a lot of that legislation will create tensions and misunderstandings. There is not enough awareness in Washington that Europe is going ahead with this. And we need to be earlier to the game to talk about such legislation with the Europeans and where there are the potential sticking points. The TTC is a good initiative, but it makes, it's very clear in the Pittsburgh statement that it will not affect how we each deal with our own domestic legislation. So I think, you know, we are kind of moving in a place where we have a lot of big issues that have been resolved. We're on the same page on a lot of things, but there is a series of challenging issues that are going to come up over the next year. And then just before you turn to some of the panelists who have a lot more domestic expertise than I have, let me just say that the US public is not really enamored of the Biden administration foreign policy. We don't know what the impact will be of Republicans holding both the Senate and the House on an already very dysfunctional congressional system. So I will just leave it there and let the domestic people take over, as well as the others.
Thank you very much indeed, Fran. Thank you for setting the scene so nicely on the transatlantic front. And we're going to zoom in on the domestic dynamics now, over to Elaine KAMARCK. Elaine is a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution, where she also directs its Center for Effective Public Management. She's somebody with practical hands-on experience in government. She was a senior policy advisor to Vice President Al Gore. And she's written very widely on US presidential and electoral nominating politics in particular, and on government reform. Her books include Primary Politics, which is about the primary system, Why Presidents Fail, and The End of Government as We Know It. Well, probably not during the Biden administration, the end of government as we know it, but will this president fail? Over to you.
Thank you, Anthony, and thank you everyone for joining us this morning in Washington, D.C. So let me frame the Biden administration in terms of what I think were the expectations of the voters when he came into office. I think they expected three things. They expected that somehow he would deal with COVID. And certainly in the first several months where they used the Defense Production Act effectively to increase the supply of vaccines, and then working with the states, they got the kinks out of the vaccine distribution system. Things were really looking up. I mean, people were very pleased with the Biden administration. They seemed to be delivering the second thing that people expected from Biden, which was competence. The Trump administration had whatever you think of his policies, he'd been sort of a mess. I have a new favorite word that is apparently from British slang. It's called shambolic. And I think it was and I'd never heard that word before, by the way, but it's a wonderful description of the Trump presidency. And so I think that in contrast, the American voters expected some competence. And they also then expected a bipartisanship. And during the campaign, reporters used to ask me a lot, well, do you really think Joe Biden could, overcome all these deep differences in the Congress and create a more bipartisan atmosphere? And my response was, I don't know, but if anyone can do it, Joe Biden can. It's just that it may be an impossible task. So now, if we look a year later, more than a year later from the campaign, on these items, you see that Biden has had a combination of bad luck and also self-inflicted wounds. So starting with COVID, obviously Omicron came and has taken over the United States, and there's lots of problems. I don't think anybody in the administration anticipated how resistant a certain portion of the public would be to vaccines and how it would turn into a completely partisan issue. And we still have loads of people who are not vaccinated. They are also getting sick and some of them are dying, but it doesn't seem to change anybody's mind. So we still have a real problem with now we've got lots of vaccines. It's really easy to get vaccines and people are still not getting them. And then I think that on COVID, there were some things that were overlooked. For instance, when Omicron hit, testing of capabilities were not up to par, and the Biden administration sort of missed the boat on that one. So basically, COVID didn't go as well in the second half of the Biden administration as Biden first year as it did in the first half, and that has brought his numbers down for sure. On the bipartisan feature, I think he would have gotten a pass had he failed to negotiate with Republicans, because the Republican Party has turned out to be a pretty tough group to negotiate with. I think what really hurt him was the fact that he couldn't negotiate with Democrats. I think that the split within the Democratic Party between the progressives and the more mainstream Democrats, the failure to rein in, the two recalcitrant senators, I think this hurt his image as somebody who was a unifier and also went to his competence. And then finally, on the issue of competence itself, I think we've got two small ones and one really big one. The small ones were, he was slow to get in the middle of the supply chain crisis. And to the extent that the supply chain crisis is impacting inflation, that's a big problem. And secondly, he was slow on inflation itself. I mean, for the couple months in the summer when this was really ramping up, he and the White House were insisting that this was transitory. And a lot of economists who supported them were saying, oh, this is transitory. And that wasn't, even if it turns out to be transitory, which it could be, that was not the message that should have been coming from the White House to people who were on the margins and really affected by inflation. But the big one was Afghanistan. And if you look at a Real Clear Politics average of his approval ratings over the first year, the most precipitous drop is in August, and it is around the mess in Afghanistan. And that, unlike a new virus coming up, that is something that people put direct blame on the president for. And it went directly to the hopes in the American people that this administration was going to be competent, as Ms. Burwell has said before, right? I mean, it is a very experienced administration, and everybody made such a big deal about it experienced, and yet out of the box, right, they've got this flop, and people were saying things like, how come they didn't plan for this? How come they didn't know this was going to happen, et cetera? And their rejoinders to those critiques were really not terribly convincing. The problem with an implementation failure like Afghanistan, a big one, is that presidents can't easily recover from them. I wrote a book, as Anthony mentioned, called Why Presidents Fail. And I looked at the first two presidents of the 21st century, George Bush and Obama. And in both of those presidencies, you see an inflection point in their approval rating where they just have a big screw up, and it's a governmental screw up, and for better or for worse, the public blames the president himself. So for George Bush, it was the botched response to Hurricane Katrina, where the United States looked like a third world country, and people were appalled that we didn't do a better job at that. For Obama, it was the failure to get the websites up for his signature achievement, the creation of a healthcare system that was going to vastly expand healthcare. And yet when it was finally announced, it took months before anybody could get on there and do with the government website what everybody does every day with Amazon or Barnes and Noble or whatever you're shopping for online. So implementation failures have a particularly damaging effect to a presidency. For Trump, it was, of course, the COVID failure. If you run history back to January 2020, Trump was very much in the game. And given a variety of characteristics of American politics, he might well have won that election. But COVID and his handling of COVID, the perception that he was bungling things, et cetera, really did him in, and he couldn't really recover from that. The question for Biden is, can he recover from the perception that we were sold a bill of goods in terms of presidential competence? And that is a very hard thing to do. On the other hand, he does have 3 more years, which is, that's the good news. And Afghanistan was not something that is front and center for most Americans. It's just a sort of thing out there. So the Afghanistan failure, despite the fact that Americans were very much in favor of the policy of getting out, the failure was extremely damaging to the presidency because it went right to the question of his competence. My final point here is that I think people don't realize how very, very close American politics is. And let me just read you 2 statistics. Of the 17 presidential elections between 1920 and 1984, 10 of them were settled by margins of 10 percentage points or more in the popular vote, and 5 were landslides. But starting in 1988 to 2020, no candidate has come close to a 10-point victory, and 5 of the past 6 have been settled by margins of less than 5 percentage points. So we are in a very, very closely divided country. And as all presidents do, I think the Biden administration was so excited to win that they thought that they could have a revolution. Well, you can't have a revolution with margins like that. You can only have an evolution. And I think that he is now recalibrating his administration to come into line with the political reality that this is still an extraordinarily closely divided country. And it makes governing difficult, and it will make electing Democrats in November difficult. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Anthony.
Thanks so much, Elaine, for that tour d'horizon of the domestic US political scene, and also for those extremely powerful statistics at the end of your intervention there. I should remind everybody who's online, and we're now, I think, over 113 people who are online, that we are talking about President Biden's second year. What will 2022 bring in US politics? And we have 6 distinguished commentators who are giving their views about the prospect domestically and internationally for this second year of the Biden administration. And the next person who's going to share their insights with us from Brussels in his case is Jakob Funk Kierkegaard, who is Senior Fellow both of the German Marshall Fund in Brussels, the GMF Europe, and also of the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C. Previously worked in the Danish Ministry of Defense and for the UN in Iraq, and has written on the US economy. So how does it look from your perspective, Jakob?
Thank you very much, Anthony. It's a pleasure to be back with you here. Well, I guess I should start from the beginning that overall the US economy looks pretty good, which is probably also why, for all the commentary about it in the coming 12 months, it's probably not going to be the economy to that extent. It's not the economy stupid this time. I think it's other things that will probably dominate the this midterm election. But let me just mention a couple of key points and also reference some comparative statistics with the situation in Europe, because obviously there is also an ongoing economic debate going on in Europe, and I think it's quite important that we have a clear understanding of what the similarities and the differences between where the US and European economies are overall. But first of all, coming into 2022, the US economy is operating pretty close to what I would consider, I think most people would consider, its economic potential. And what I mean by that is that if you take the growth trend before the pandemic and basically assumes that the pandemic never happened, then the US economy is roughly where it would have been had the pandemic not happened. Because before the pandemic, because of the Trump tax cuts and other things, the US economy was also doing quite well. Just today, you heard new GDP figures come out for the EU and the Euro area, etc., where we quote unquote celebrated that the Euro area was now finally above the pre-pandemic level of GDP. That sounds as if it's almost the same as the United States, but it's not. The reality is that if the Euro area, or the EU for that matter, it's roughly the same numbers, had continued to grow at the trend growth rate of that it experienced before the pandemic started, we are still somewhere between 3.5 and 4 percentage points below that level. So, in GDP terms, it is unambiguous, therefore, that the United States is very considerably ahead of the European economies. This is true also when you're looking at domestic demand, which means that the US growth has been powered by it. It's not at all an export-led recovery, which certainly in some European countries has been the case. And we have seen a shift in that demand, which I shall come back to a little later, so that consumption is now more driven towards goods than services. It's obviously a direct function of the lockdowns that we have seen also in the US economy, which is something quite similar to the situation in many European economies. But because of the significant increases in disposable income in the United States, you have higher inflation. During the pandemic, the fiscal situation in 2022 for the US under current law is actually equally dramatic in some ways, but with a minus in front of it. Because if you look at the fiscal impulse, or basically fiscal policy, under...
Could you just repeat the this section concerning the dramatic decline that we're going to witness in share of GDP? Wasn't entirely clear to me, and I suspect others. What this is? Is it the budget deficit, or was it the injection?
It's basically the budget deficit. It's scheduled to come down by from a very high level to a not very high level. But what you're talking about here is to change the deficit. It's somewhere between 8 and 9% of GDP. Which is, in macroeconomic terms, a fairly astronomical number, and certainly not one that I would advise any government to implement in an election year, which is, of course, precisely why one of the big fights over the economy in 2022 is going to be, during the first quarter about potential additional fiscal stimulus, the Build Back Better agenda, which is currently stuck in Congress. Because unless you do that, you really do face some fairly dramatic fiscal contraction. Turning to the labor market, there's also several important implications or differences between the US and Europe. Overall, the US labor market is in good shape. It's tight, if you like. The question is how tight. Certainly, if you look at the some indicators, the traditional unemployment rate is now below 4% again. If you look at the so-called quits rate, which basically measures the share of people that quit their jobs voluntarily every month, this is also at historically high levels. So that would indicate that there isn't much extra slack in the US economy. However, if you look at other metrics, and arguably, in my opinion, more important metrics, it's less ambiguous, it's more ambiguous. Because if you look at the employment rate in the United States today, you see that it's still about 1.5 percentage points below where it was before the pandemic. That translates into roughly 3 million jobs. And again, if you take the more accurate assumption of looking at the pre-pandemic trend job growth in the United States, you are still over 5 million jobs short of where you would have been without the pandemic. And therefore, the real big question for the US labor market is are those very number of Americans that have left the labor force during the pandemic, are they going to come back or not? We simply don't know that. But it's important to note that while on the other hand, of course, unemployment rates in Europe are higher than in the United States, considerably higher, even though they have come down. But unlike in the United States, the European economies they've actually in the third quarter data, which just came out, you have record high employment and activity. Economy. So therefore, from that perspective, it's actually the European economies that relative to the pre-pandemic situation is arguably in better shape than what you see in the United States. This also has important implications for a big, financial issue at the moment, which is obviously inflation. There, if you look at, and there my preferred metric is to look at levels of two-year inflation, because you avoid differences in the inflation 2 years, and you compare transatlantically, you will see that European levels are roughly half that of the United States. This is predominantly due to both the situation in the labor market, but also that, as I said earlier, you have had a much larger fiscal stimulus, you've had a much larger increase in disposable income, and which has been sort of translated into higher levels of goods consumption, which has given higher levels of bottlenecks in the U.S. economy than what you have seen in the EU. So what that means is that yes, nominal wages in the U.S. has been rising significantly, faster than in the euro area, but real wages in the U.S. Is again relative to the pre-pandemic trend, is now between 3 and 4 percentage points below where they would have been had the pandemic not happened. And this is because we have had so many years with very low levels of inflation in the US and elsewhere, is a very new situation for many Americans. And it's obviously something that goes well beyond the traditional focus on gas prices and things like that. So this is, I would contend, is arguably becoming a political problem for the Biden administration. It also spills over. There seems to be a fairly strong link, again, between consumer confidence and inflation expectations on households, so that as inflation has gone up, consumer confidence, as measured by the Michigan and other indices, have gone dramatically into decline. So, you really, from that perspective, ironically, you probably may not want too big a fiscal stimulus by Congress next year. If you're looking at monetary policy, current projections indicate that the Fed, if you're looking at forecasters, will say the Fed is going to hike rates by either between 4 or 5 times in 2022. That's a significant increase, admittedly from zero, but still. And that certainly should translate into continued rising dollar. And also, we know that from previous periods of rising US interest rates, probably quite a lot of financial turmoil in emerging markets. And then finally, for a Biden presidency who likes to talk a lot about union jobs and the likes of, it's worth noting that the US trade deficit in goods is now well over $1 trillion on an annualized basis. That is probably also not going to be sustainable politically, and I think certainly will become a political issue during 2022 as well, because it is something that Biden himself, as a sort of blue-collar union president, has made an issue, but it's one that he's vulnerable on. So let me finish there.
Thank you very much indeed, Jakob. Fascinating statistics there. I'm sorry we missed some of them because there was a connection problem. But I mean, I think the basic message, correct me if I'm wrong, is that the US economy has been performing pretty well, is now pretty much where it would have been without the coronavirus crisis. But employment levels and real wages are below where they would otherwise have been. And you've got this strange dichotomy on the one hand of a fairly rapidly contracting budget deficit, but a absolutely titanic trade deficit. Incidentally, the word shambolic is the adjective of shambles, which is a kind of historic English word for, I think, a kind of butchers or whatever. So the suggestion was that there was a lot of stuff all over the place, a bit like the phrase dog's breakfast. And perhaps that's a good way also of describing some governments, including the one in the United Kingdom at the moment. Now, we go next to Bruce Stokes, who's in Washington. He's the Executive Director of the Transatlantic Task Force of the GMF. Previously, he was Director of Global Economic Attitudes at Pew Research Center and has been the International Economics columnist for the National Journal and a Senior Fellow of the Council on Foreign Relations. Over to you, Bruce.
To be with everybody, and especially I see a lot of friends on the panel, so it's great to share this podium with them. In terms of conveying to our audience some issues, I think one to start up with as we think about 2022 is that I would contend that America is an increasingly unstable democracy, and that our friends in Europe in particular need to be aware of that and factor this in. American culture, especially with its focus on instant gratification and short-termism, has now infected American politics. I think it amplifies Americans' distrust of government and politics. I always like to refer to my father, who was a Goldwater Republican and whose view of politicians was pretty low. And he used to say, sometimes you just need to throw the bums out and get new bums. And I think this is an attitude that many Americans share. For instance, in the 24 elections between 1952 and 1998, the House, the Senate, and or the White House, in other words, one or more of those institutions, changed hands 9 times in 24 elections. In the last 11 elections between 2000 and 2020, we've also had 9 changes. So we've gone from 9 in 24 elections to 9 in 11 elections. And I think, as was said before, I think it's almost inevitable that the House of Representatives will change hands in this upcoming elections. Since 1940 or the 1940s, in the 7 times when a president's job approval rating was below 50%, and bear in mind that Biden's approval rating is now in the low 40s, that president, any president with an approval rating below 50%, has lost an average of 43 seats in the House of Representatives. Now, obviously, past is not prologue necessarily, but I think we have to assume that the Democrats, who only have a 5-seat majority in the House, will lose the House of Representatives. And what that will mean for the ability of the Biden administration to get things done domestically, and maybe even in on some cases internationally, is going to be very, very constrained. Jacob did a very good job of outlining the issues of the economy. I think the real dichotomy is the fact that the economy, other than for inflation, is doing very, very well. And yet the public, only 17% of the public is satisfied with the direction of the country. The 57% say the economy is on the wrong track. I think this reflects a public view, which I think maybe is shared in many countries in Europe, that whoever is in power is really daddy, and we want daddy to solve the problems, and daddy isn't solving the problem. And the problem that people are most worried about these days in the United States is inflation. 61% blame Biden for higher gas prices. Not at all clear why it's his fault, but they blame him. And 56% have no confidence in Biden's ability to control inflation. I think Jacob would agree with this, that there's very little a president can do about inflation. That is a Federal Reserve responsibility. But that same poll showed that a plurality of the public believes that the Federal Reserve can't control inflation. So there is this sense that I'm worried about this issue. It's rising prices, but and I blame people who are may or may not be responsible for that problem. And it's, so there's a sense of despair around those issues. Just a short bit on some of the transatlantic challenges we see. I think one of the challenges we will face, depending on what happens in Ukraine, is can we keep the alliance together on these issues? In particular, can Europe stay together on sanction issues? And I think that's an unresolved question at this point. But if we do have to impose these massive sanctions that have been threatened, I think then the rubber hits the road. And I think Americans are not fully aware or acknowledging of the fact that the economic sanctions will hurt Europe. The economic sanctions on Russia will hurt Europe more than they will hurt the United States. Europe is much more economically engaged with Russia than we are. And I think that there has to be some accommodation in American policy to adjust to that fact if we're going to keep Europe together and thus the alliance together, if we have to go to sanctions on Russia. And bear in mind, looming in the distance are the possibility we may have to impose sanctions, or at least there may be calls to impose sanctions on China if China ramps up its pressure on Taiwan. And again, we face the challenge that the European economy is actually more dependent on China, trade and investment with China, than we are, the United States. And again, we're asking a lot of Europe if we end up having to ask Europe to impose sanctions on both Russia and China, hurting the European economy more than it would hurt the United States economy. One issue that I'm relatively certain most Americans haven't paid attention to, but I think is a very important looming issue, is the ability of the Biden administration to deliver on some of its climate commitments. Bear in mind that a huge portion of the Build Back Better legislation that is probably dead on Capitol Hill had to do with climate issues. So that commitment of resources to deal with climate change may not be available, almost certainly will not be available, I think. But actually, more importantly, is a Supreme Court case that will be heard this spring. It's called West Virginia versus the Environmental Protection Agency. And at issue is whether the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States has the right, the power, to regulate CO2 emissions. Because when the legislation was first passed in 1970, no one was worried about CO2 emissions. So it's not spelled out in that legislation that the EPA has that right and that power. It has been assumed under that legislation that the EPA would decide what it needs to do to keep the air clean and deal with air pollution. Conservative Americans and some conservatives on the Supreme Court believe that that regulatory power of the administrative agencies in the United States can only be exercised if it's spelled out and precisely in legislation. If that view would prevail in this very conservative Supreme Court, there would, I say, be almost no ability for the United States to go after methane or CO2 anytime soon, because Congress is tied in knots on these issues. And if Congress has to actually pass specific legislation, Europeans will find themselves not able to cooperate with the United States on key climate change issues. I agree with Jacob. I think that an interesting issue that has not gotten any political traction yet is the rise in the U.S. trade deficit during COVID. The question is whether it will become an issue before the election, and will there be pressure on the administration to do something about that. On trade, there is an issue that the administration has done absolutely nothing in terms of progress on WTO reform. This was an issue that Europe was hopeful for with the Biden administration. Nothing has happened. The public won't care about this, but I doubtless say that many people in Brussels will care if there's another year of failure to make progress on reform of the WTO. And I think, as Fran said, the TTC is a huge accomplishment in this first year of the Biden administration, terribly important for transatlantic relations. But the real challenge is going to be, can the U.S. maintain its political engagement on this issue, keep cabinet ministers involved, because that has always been the challenge in the U.S., that Brussels and its political leadership is more committed to these kinds of discussions than the American political leadership continues to be. And I think that will determine the fate of the TTC going forward. So with that, I'll close and look forward to the discussion.
Very many thanks, Bruce, and thanks especially for that very elegant combination of the political and economic which you bring to bear on these occasions. We come back to Europe, not the European Union, but the United Kingdom, to London, where Leslie VINJAMURI, who is Director for the US and Americas Programme at the Royal Institute of International Relations, Chatham House, is going to join us. She's also Dean of Chatham House's QE2 Academy for Leadership in International Affairs. She's also a reader in international relations at SOAS and a member of the advisory board of LSE Ideas. Over to Leslie.
So thank you, and thank you for having me, Anthony. And it's great to be on the panel with all of these very distinguished and very eloquent colleagues and friends. I'll just add a few things. And I guess the first thing I should say is that I'm not quite sure what's happened in the UK, but clearly it's been a very robustly dynamic couple of hours, not least for Boris Johnson, Theresa May, and others. But so far as I know, the current government is still standing. Normally on these panels, I talk about the US, but with Bruce and others here, maybe I'll take a slightly different angle and just add a few things. I do want to pick up on some of the points that Bruce made so eloquently. And that is, I think that I guess if Bruce said that Europe should be aware and worried that America's democracy is fragile, I kind of had in my notes to start out with the idea that certainly where I sit in the UK, people are deeply worried about this. They're very much aware that America's democracy seems to not be what people thought it once was. And of course, there's lots of questions about, was America's democracy ever what people thought it was? But it clearly feels categorically different to many people. One of the interesting things, of course, if you look at the broad outlines of the UK foreign policy today, is that there doesn't seem to be actually much hedging in the UK. There's clearly a robust debate in the European Union about strategic autonomy and European sovereignty, but that is not, I would argue, the case in the UK. Nonetheless, there is a sort of overarching question about, how resilient is America's democracy? Will there be a tipping point after which there will be a move back to the moderate wing of the Republican Party? And I think people were certainly watching Trump very carefully over the weekend and reactions to Trump by those who were putting forward legislation to revive or to alter the electoral count vote, things that could really alter the solidity of America's democracy going forward. So, or will there be, we're all watching the sort of recent spate of publications on the prospects for further electoral violence, or even, in the words of Barb Walter, the prospect for civil war, although she's quite moderate in her line. So it's being watched very, very carefully, and I think that is something to note. I guess that on the three things that people are watching, and I tend to set these out because I think they're distinct but overlapping. One is democracy, and especially polarization, and especially what's happening in the Republican Party. The second is restraint, and I'll say a few words about that. And the third, and we haven't talked about it, and I think it's really important, and I find it, to be very honest, disturbing, because people tend to put this out there as in a sort of general big category without really breaking it down, and that's about demography and demographic change in the United States. So maybe I'll say a little bit more about that. But on democracy, I think that the number one concern, in addition to us all knowing that debates about inflation and all the rest of it are actually, as Bruce said, seen through a polarized lens, and that's what in some ways makes the fact of things like inflation more disturbing to European, or at least to those in the UK, than the reality of it, is that Americans seem to so disagree. There's so much focus on the midterms, which of course, as we know, is new as of the last midterms. But it's really there. But there is just a deep question about what America's democracy will mean for its leadership overseas. And in the UK, it's a funny one, because of course the UK itself is focused on similar, if very differently expressed, issues in its own democracy. So an ongoing question that I would argue that people in the UK understand and are watching, but don't have a very strong lens or sense of what to do about it. And the dominant approach seems to be to anchor UK foreign policy quite closely alongside American foreign policy, at least on the security lens, again, which I think is very different from the EU. On the restraint question, I think that the big question here is has long been in traction, but I think it was really Afghanistan when people in the UK started to say, wow, the doctrine of restraint, if it even is a thing, and it's certainly very contested, what will it mean for the UK? And despite the AUKUS moment that in some ways, moved the headlines to a different position, the conversation about the UK being essentially powerless to alter the course of history with respect to Afghanistan and US foreign policy continues at the level of murmurings and deep concern and deep discontent. And so it's not only a question, I think, of security restraint and what will that mean for the UK. It's a question of a restraint with respect to humanitarianism. And there's obviously a question of restraint on the economic side, and that gets to the question of trade, market access, tariffs. And I think on all of these dimensions, there's a concern about what level of influence the UK can have over US foreign policy, how much to align, and what the direction of travel will be. And then finally, and I think this is perhaps the longest standing debate, is who will America's, in reorienting its foreign policy and its foreign economic policy, who will America's key partner be? And will it be that, there's a sense that it needs to be either or, the UK or Europe. I think that's not true, but I think that's how it's read in the UK. And I think the AUKUS moment certainly gave the UK hope on the security side, and we're seeing that certainly in the current crisis, that the UK is standing again strong and aligning itself very carefully with the US. But there's a broader set of question marks when it comes to the big debates over economic policy, over trade and technology, and over what role the UK can really play on that with respect to US economic strategy, if and when it emerges in the context of China. But let me say a little bit about the demography question, because I think it's a really interesting one. And you know, time and again, and this precedes the election of Joe Biden, I've heard those many distinguished thinkers and leaders in the UK saying, America's demography is changing. We all know that around 2050, it will be a majority minority country, that whites are increasingly less well represented across the states, that non-whites are increasingly vocal. Obviously, we had the summer of Black Lives Matter, which spilled over beyond America's borders, but meant something very different certainly in the UK, but I think everywhere. And there's a genuine concern that this means, that something's changing in the US, not only with respect to its democracy and with respect to its internationalism, but that this inevitably means something very, very different for the US-UK relationship, and perhaps for America's relationship with Europe. But then it sort of, the argument gets a little bit stuck there. And I guess I would put a few questions out there. One is, I think there's a real need for serious and rigorous analysis about what exactly this means, and what might drive, or what challenges might be thrown up as America experiences demographic change, as we see a very progressive and vocal wing of the Democratic Party, as we see internal debates and divisions between white Americans and other Americans. But there's not very much of there's not a very careful linkage between what it means for America's overall relative economic power and its political power to be changing, and its orientation towards China as opposed to Europe to be changing, paired with the demographic argument. And if you take a strictly demographic argument, you would expect that in fact the US might be less focused on Europe. It wouldn't really have anything to do with its broader geopolitical realignment. So there's a real disconnect, I think, in the analysis of what's driving America's relationship with Europe, whether it's demography at home or whether it's geopolitical considerations abroad. And I think that's something really worth drilling down on. So I'll stop. There's a lot to be discussed. But overall, I'd say that the UK is concerned, but very much self-absorbed, and therefore not really having a serious conversation about how or whether to hedge against America's democracy and the challenges that it faces going forward.
Thank you very much indeed, Leslie, and thank you for giving those wider transatlantic reflections, and also the specific vantage point from London, and also posing questions which we might want to consider as part of the Q&A conversation. We've got about 3 questions have come in from members of the audience, and that's a good moment to remind everybody who's online, still well over 100, that you can pose a question either through the Q&A support function or the EPRS WebEx function in the chat room there. So please do that if you'd like to ask a question. We'll be coming to them shortly after we've heard from, last but not least, from Dave Winston, who is our final panelist for the afternoon here in Brussels. Dave is president of the Winston Group, named after his good self, which is a Washington DC polling and survey research company. He's been a strategic advisor to the Senate and House Republican leaderships on Capitol Hill for much of the last 20 years, and was previously director of planning for the then Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich. He's also been a fellow at the Heritage Foundation and is an election analyst for CBS News and a weekly columnist for the Roll Call newspaper on Capitol Hill. So over to you, Dave.
Thank you, Anthony. Sorry, I hope I wasn't giving everybody a heart attack in terms of coming in and out in terms of the camera. I've been just having some problems here. Well, welcome everybody. In looking at this election, I want to start off with actually how I thought Biden won in 2020, and it really it was an interesting environment in that actually when you look at the electorate from exit polls, it became It moved slightly in the Republicans' direction. In 2016, Democrats had a 3-point party advantage. In 2020, it was only a 1-point advantage. If you take a look at the conservative liberal spread in 2016, conservatives had a lead over liberals of 11. That increased to 15 in 2020. So actually, the political environment for Republicans, in theory, should have been a lot better. What happened to Trump was he lost the political center. In 2016, he won independents by 4. In 2020, he lost them by 13. And just to give you a sense of how big 13 actually is as a number, if you go back, the last major political party candidate to lose by 13 or more in terms of independents was Walter Mondale. Right. Michael Dukakis in 1988 actually outperformed Donald Trump amongst independents. So when Biden was elected, he was elected very much by the political center. The problem you have, and which you see in a lot of these midterm elections, is the immediate fight or dynamic a president faces, excuse me, after getting elected, is how does he govern and manage the process of those people who got him elected president versus those who won him the nomination. Now, actually, in his particular case, the nomination came from basically African Americans 45 plus. So it was a different part of the party base that actually tends to be on some issues much more moderate than other parts of the Democratic Party. But nonetheless, he came into this environment and immediately was faced with the challenge of the hard political base of his party pushing him in a legislative direction. And just to give you a construct of just what the country looks like, at least in terms of the two-party bases, in 2020, according to the Edison exit polls, 17% of the country were liberal Democrats, 26% of the country were conservative Republicans, 53% were something else. So the political center, while not necessarily participating at the scale in terms of primaries, when you get to general elections, really do matter. And so the president is currently faced with that. What happens, and you saw this happen with both President Obama, with President Trump, and you're seeing it occur with President Biden, is that there is this difficulty in understanding from those administrations what was an important issue and what was a priority issue. And what you saw happen with President Obama, going back to 2010, is he was very much focused on healthcare, an incredibly important issue. But the month of the 2010 election, we were in our 19th consecutive month of 9% or more unemployment, which actually lasted for 30 months. Donald Trump, everybody was focused on the economy. And he decided the weekend before the election that it was going to be about the caravan coming from Mexico, as opposed to the terrific jobs report we had, which is frustrating from my perspective, and managed to find a way in terms of that. And Democrats won an overwhelming victory. President Biden, I think, is having the same challenge here. He's focused on a variety of different issues, but ultimately it's coming down to the economy and one specific component of the economy, which we put in the economic term of inflation. For most Americans, it's called cost of living. And so what you've seen is cost of living increase at a faster rate than wages are going up. And that's a real significant challenge. Bear with me, my first political campaign was in 1982 when Republicans lost 26 seats because unemployment jumped over 10%. It is hard to explain or make strong enough the point that the electorate is very, very sensitive to economic issues, and the political center more so than any other group, because they're not involved in the partisan base issues that sort of drive those groups. The challenge that President Biden has, and I'm going to go through, and these are pretty grim numbers for him. His overall job approval from Real Clear Politics is 42 to 55. 42% is a difficult place to be, but think of it in this terms. Every time he goes and makes a statement, he's got a majority of the country is looking at what he's saying through the lens of they disapprove of generally what he's been doing. Having worked for Newt at points where he had not dissimilar numbers, that's just a very challenging position to try to promote policy positions from. More importantly, and I get this from Economist YouGov being one of the more recent surveys, his job approval with the independents is a staggering 26 to 64. What that simply means at this point, as Democrats look toward the fall election, is that basically the majority coalition that he put in place to elect him isn't there at the moment. And he's got to figure out some way to sort of re-engage with independents at some scale to begin to pull them back in. Otherwise, it's going to be a very difficult election for him personally in terms of the amount of seats potentially losing. When you look at specific issues too, so for example, on the economy, again, the Real Clear Politics averages, he's at 38% favorable approve, 57% disapprove. Again, challenging situation. This isn't just simply putting points on the board. He's got to do some things that, really turn numbers around. I'll go back to the 1982 lovely experience. As we were in the process of moving toward 10% unemployment, the line that, for some reason that I still don't understand to this day, that was developed in terms of the message was stay the course. And people are like, why would I want to do that? We're moving, unemployment is, and I think part of the challenge this White House has got to realize is if they're basically saying the same thing, stay the course in sort of in different words, that's going to produce similar results. So he's got to really think through, in fact, what he can do to sort of change this dynamic. Now, from the Republican point of view, having it focus on the economy, given when you look at polls that generally Republicans have a slight advantage in terms of issue handling, it's a good issue for Republicans to be on. The challenge they're going to have is it's not just simply saying that Biden's wrong, because there's already an agreement there, at least at this point. It's then what direction are you therefore going to define moving forward from that point? When you, at this point, again, Republicans only need 5 congressional seats to get the majority. Again, part of the challenge that certainly Nancy Pelosi has faced is this has been one of the slimmest majorities that anybody's had to manage. And basically at 5 seats, there are a lot of tiny groups in your conference, having worked for Newt, who can then at that point sort of take things in a lot of different directions. She's had to struggle through that. And obviously Schumer has been in with the split Senate. The Senate and the House are both clearly in play. And so I think part of the challenge in terms of developing policy as we go forward, particularly on the Democratic side, is you have individuals who are now not sure of what's the distance they should have between them and their president. And then you get to but there's the one card that everybody sort of on the Democratic side looks to, and on the Republican side is worried about, and that is just what is Trump going to mean in terms of this particular election. I think that's unclear. For some, the recent NBC poll that basically showed a flip in terms of, so would you consider yourself a Trump supporter or a member of the Republican Party? That flipped and it was 58% said Republican Party, 36% said Trump. That's an interesting transition. Part of the challenge that Trump has been having is he's been trying to sell Republicans that they need to agree with him and work through the relitigation of the 2020 election. Created some interesting conversations as a result of that. But ultimately, I think the thing to look for is the performance of Biden getting to a point where it's not Biden contrast to Trump, which is what the 2020 election was. It's just purely Biden. If that's the case, that's obviously a positive for Republicans, but Republicans still have the challenge, no matter what, is, all right, there's a reason to look at another party because of Biden's performance. So what is the value proposition you're laying out that would cause people to vote for you? And I think that's kind of the stage we're at right now in terms of where things are politically here. So with that, Anthony, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks very much for that, Dave. And we now come to the Q&A session, and I'm going to actually follow up directly on what the issue that Dave was just posing, by kind of posing a question or putting a question to the 3 commentators, Dave included, who have had a primarily domestic focus, namely Elaine, Bruce, and Dave, which is to say, Dave, you drew this distinction just now between the presidential election where it was Biden versus Trump, and as you put it, in 2022, it's just Biden. But Trump hasn't gone away. I mean, he's very, very visible on the political stage. And do you therefore consider, and I'd be interested in the views of the others I've just mentioned, that Trump is a potential asset or a potential liability in the midterm elections?
Oh, thank you. I think what you're defining there is one of the key strategic unknowns at this point. At this point, if he goes down the path of wanting to try to force this to be a discussion about the relitigation of the 2020 election, that is not helpful to the Republican Party, and it's quite helpful to the Democrats. And to some degree, you saw that happen in the California recall with Newsom, when he got Elder to, in fact, embrace the idea that this is a relitigation of 2020, and that didn't work. You noticed that in the Virginia governor's race, Youngkin basically kept arm's distance in terms of all those issues and said, here's what I'm running on. I'm very happy to have his endorsement, and then moved on right away. Having said that, I don't think the resolution of that is clear. I think what Democrats may have learned from the Youngkin race is that where you're dealing with candidates who are trying to create distance, how do you manage that particular situation? And I don't think there's a resolution, and I think you're going to watch Democrats go through a whole process of resolving that. On the Republican side, I will tell you there are a lot of people who are looking at the Youngkin race saying, gee, how could I do that? Because again, remember, Biden won Virginia by 10 points. So that wasn't like a small victory. I mean, he pretty solidly won that. So I think you've got strategic challenges in front of both parties in terms of how to deal with this. Again, I will say that the relitigation of the 2020 election is not necessarily a topic that let me be tougher about that. Relitigating the 2020 election is not a topic the country wants to hear about when they're trying to deal with cost of living and trying to figure out how they can get their kids back to school, how they can figure out how to get the economy working and how to beat the coronavirus. All four of those easily surpass that.
Elaine, what's your take on that?
I agree. I largely agree with Mr. Winston there. And I think looking at the Youngkin race is actually a good one. I would add that to switch a lot of these Democratic seats to Republican seats, the Republican candidate is going to have to win over those same independent voters, right? And so to achieve that switch, having Donald Trump in the mix is absolutely not a good idea. Okay, and quite a distraction. I would call attention for our audience to a piece in the Washington Post on Sunday by Dan Baltz, which looks in depth at some polling in the Republican Party and shows a distance opening up between Trump supporters, hardline Trump supporters, and other Republicans. So there's now a faction of the Republican Party that says Trump is more important than party. And there's a faction that says party is more important than Trump. And the latter faction actually has been growing. So that is, I think, consistent with where Mr. Winston went. And it's also something that should strike fear in the hearts of Democrats.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask Bruce Stokes to put his old Pew Research Center hat on as a professional pollster of yesteryear. How do you see the Trump component, if you like, in the midterm elections? And to whose advantage is it?
Yeah, look, I think it probably is largely up to Trump. Depends how he acts, what he does, and what the candidates who seek his support do. I think, as Dave said, Youngkin, I think, manages very well. I would caution we can't over-interpret the Youngkin victory in Virginia in the sense that he was running against somebody who was trying to be governor for the second time. And I think he came off as yesterday's news, and Youngkin was the new fresh face. But Youngkin did a very great for not being a political pro, he did a great job of kind of embracing Trump and distancing himself from Trump at the same time. And I thought that that's the lesson that I think an interesting race to watch will be, there's an open seat for the Senate in Pennsylvania. And there are a couple of Republicans who are running who will either seek, Dr. Oz, who is this television personality, is very close to Trump. But the question will be, what role does Trump play in that primary for the Republicans and then for the general election. My gut feeling is that if the Democrats believe they can somehow win elections by warning that if you vote for the Republican, you're voting for Trump, that's not going to carry it. David's right. I mean, for the average American, yes, they may not like Trump. They may wish he would go away, but they're worried about inflation. They're worried about a variety of issues that I think will be more important to them than whether this guy who's running for the Senate is has been endorsed by Trump or not.
Thank you very much for that. I'm going to now pick up on some of the questions that have come in from the digital audience. One that was posed by Christoph Fellner, picking up on Fran Burwell's initial remarks, was how far do you think that this whole digital cyber set of issues, whether to do with Europe's attempt to set global standards in this field or any transatlantic trade or regulatory tension on them, could turn out either directly or indirectly to be a kind of campaign issue in the forthcoming midterm elections? And then, so that's very much, I think, directed at Fran. And then more widely, including Fran, but perhaps also Leslie and Jakob, from Nerithius Prakevicius, I hope I've pronounced your name correctly. And then secondly, from Nerithius Prakevicius, which dimensions of Biden's foreign policy do you think are most likely to, or would be most likely to survive a Republican majority in Congress? And is there anything approaching what you could call a clear Republican alternative to Biden's foreign policy? So perhaps first over to Fran.
Yes, and sorry, I'm going to have to leave in a few minutes, but on the digital issue, I think that the only one that's I do think this is an area where we're going to see a lot more direct US-EU consultation and conflict. But in terms of what does the American public care about, I think that the only thing that you will see as part of the election campaign in 2022 are the issues of competition policy and to some extent social online content moderation. I think those two things will surface to some degree in the election, but I think they're very small compared to the people who are compared to inflation, cost of living, things like that. There will obviously be a lot of discussion about online content in terms of how it is, not in terms of regulating it necessarily, but in terms of its impact on the election. In terms of a Republican majority and what it means for foreign policy, we have lost over the last 8 years or so most of the Republican foreign policy generalists, I would say. So the old style Republican mainstream kind of Kissingerian, et cetera, is now missing. Whether they can come back is an open question that I'm not quite sure of. Most of the Republicans are not running on foreign policy issues. If they are concerned with those, they have, I would say, a very hard line, both towards Russia and towards China. And so if they were to come into power, either up on Capitol Hill, I think we would see more attempts to sanction Russia and China for all sorts of behavior. If they were to actually come into power in the next presidential election, if you have something like that, I think it's going to make it much more difficult for the allies in terms of maintaining coherence with US policy. I think most Republicans, except for the Trump Republicans, are very much in favor of NATO, but are much more critical of NATO members primarily for the effort in terms of defense spending, et cetera like that. One of the things we have seen among many Republicans that I find somewhat disturbing, and it relates back to President Trump, is a lot more criticism of Germany. that has taken hold in the Republican Party. So I think there are some concerns for the alliance, not per se, if there's a larger Republican role, a Republican domination of the American foreign policy debate, but that we will see more anti-Russian, and I mean blanket anti-Russian rhetoric and actions, and the same with China. So less ability to kind of distinguish between certain issues and things of that nature. And of course, any attempt to rebuild US participation in the Iran negotiations will be subject to incredibly strong Republican opposition. So thank you.
Yes, thank you also for sparing the time to join us. We really appreciate that. I appreciate you're under a bit of time pressure. Leslie, how do you see these things?
Yeah, I mean, on the foreign policy question and how the Republicans do, I mean, I broadly agree with Fran. I would add a couple of things. One is that on the UK dimension, you know, I don't think there's any love lost between the current US administration and the current leadership in the UK. And of course, things could change in the UK. But if to the extent that the Republicans become more influential in the US, that, you know, could certainly actually play to the favor of the current government in the UK. Not so much the level of foreign policy, because that's broadly aligned, but just in terms of, you know, the oiling the machine and things working more smoothly. In terms of policy, I think a couple of things. Clearly, you know, the question of Iran, I think will get tougher if the Republicans do well in the midterms or in 2024. But the other, the issue that wasn't mentioned, I guess, is climate. And that hasn't been, you know, getting spending through that. It's domestic spending, but has an impact on climate, which is ultimately a foreign policy issue, has already been challenging, will get more challenging to the extent that Republicans gain more influence on the Hill and beyond. And then I guess the other point is just economic strategy. Everybody's waiting to see what the U.S. Economic strategy will be in Asia. That's been slow to develop, and I think there has been some hope that perhaps at some point in time there might be more opening towards U.S. economic engagements. I know I'm sure Bruce is going to say no, but even, you know, I think over here people hope that maybe even one day with the Democrats in charge that the U.S. would think about CPTPP or other regional strategies, and presumably that those questions would fall entirely off the table if the Republicans were to gain more sway. But a harder line on China, a harder line on Russia for sure. And then the final thing I would say is just that, you know, the values, the ideological turn, certainly with respect to China, rose to the fore under Trump and Pompeo's leadership. Obviously, democracy and authoritarianism has continued to be a strategic frame adopted by the Biden administration, but it's come with a increasingly larger degree of pragmatism. And that kind of pragmatism versus ideology balance could potentially change, leaning more towards ideology and values with a return of the Republicans to Congress.
Thank you. I'll give Bruce a chance to come in a bit later as to how big a no he communicates on that one. But first of all, Jakob.
No, I mean, I don't want to comment on foreign policy, but I just want to really emphasize the point Leslie just made of the role of climate, because if a Republican majority supported, I think it was Bruce who mentioned it, by a very, very conservative Supreme Court, basically prevents, you know, meaningful U.S. federal government engagement in the climate, you know, decarbonization, climate change fight, etc. You're going to have, first of all, I think, a major transatlantic trade war, because you're not going to have, it's already going to be very difficult, because I think Fran mentioned it, there's no price on carbon at the federal level in the United States. That makes it difficult without a high degree of, if you like, political and regulatory trust between the US and the EU to exempt US producers from a CBAM, a European CBAM, which is absolutely clearly coming, certainly at the current ETS price levels that we're seeing at close to 80 euros or 90 euros. So we're going to have a trade war, and potentially one that's very significant. And I would even go as far, depending on how the Chinese leadership would play that situation. But, at China that, was suddenly prepared to make more moves also on the climate front, could very well undo a lot of the, getting back together or putting the transatlantic relationship back together by simply, being able to draw the EU closer to its, if you like, geopolitical orbit or whatever you want to call it. But no, I would absolutely highlight that climate would be the potential bull in the China store for the general transatlantic economic relationship, unless, of course, the U.S. business community is able to lean on, a potentially ascendant Republic political leadership in Congress.
Thanks for that. Bruce, any thoughts on not only the China dimension, but more generally the foreign policy challenges if the Republicans gain a majority in both houses?
Well, I'm not sure I understood Leslie's point, but the thing is, I think that the developments with Russia and Ukraine, we don't know how that's going to play out, but it is well, we expect administrations to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. But this is a lot of walking and chewing gum at the same time because these are really big issues. And it was clear before Ukraine blew up that this administration wanted to just keep Russia on the sidelines, kind of manage that relationship as best as possible, but give it, kind of containment by not really engaging. And that's obviously not the case now. And I think the ball is really in China's court as to whether it sees this as an opportunity to cause mayhem in Asia, because this administration really did want to pivot to Asia. I think that Afghanistan and AUKUS were in part what the pivot to Asia looks like. And that's going to cause problems in the transatlantic relationship, even if Ukraine calms down, because the US basically will increasingly be preoccupied with Asia in meaningful ways. And Europeans have to, on one hand, step up, and secondly, to understand that that doesn't mean that somehow we're abandoning Europe. But that adjustment by the Europeans to what is an inevitable move by the United States has now been interrupted, it would seem to me, by the Ukraine crisis. And the question is, does it totally interrupt that pivot? And the Biden administration for the next few years is really more engaged with Europe than previous administrations, at least have Obama or Trump were. I would echo what Leslie said, that there is growing frustration, especially among Republicans, with Germany. But I say also we have to worry about Democrats being frustrated with Germany. And if Republicans get into power in the Congress and maybe take the White House in 2024, I think Europeans have to be very wary that if there's a perception in the United States, and it's amplified maybe by Republicans who were angry at Europe for many years over NATO and military spending and things like that, if there's a perception that somehow Europe didn't stand with the United States in a united fashion about Ukraine, this will damage the transatlantic relationship and will be thrown back in Europeans' face. And I think, Europeans have their own politics in this. They have to deal with them in their own ways, but there are going to be consequences in the United States, in the relationship with the United States, if there's a perception that somehow the Germans were wishy-washy about this, and maybe some other Europeans, want to peel away from sanctions at some point. All of which is speculative now, but I think we have to be wary of it and try to avoid that outcome, because we know that there are certainly Republicans, and especially Trump, who wanted to reduce the transatlantic relationship when they were in power. And I think that's something we have to be very very concerned about. And just to echo what Jacob just said, I think that the incoming officials in the Biden administration thought that they knew they could not put a price on carbon in the United States. They would never get that through Congress, and they were going to try to address the issue through regulation, and somehow have an equivalent price for carbon through regulation. And that's what they're trying to do. That's what, as Fran mentioned, green steel is an attempt to try to do that in a very, very minor way. But that's much more difficult to do. And if the Supreme Court strips the ability of regulatory agencies to kind of do that on their own, we're in for, I think, real problems transatlantically on climate in the next couple of years, and for good reason, because I think the U.S. has to step up, and we would not be able to step up.
Thank you for that. We've got a question in. We're beginning to run out of time here, so I'm going to make this the last question. We've got a question in here from Etienne Bassot. It's also an observation. He says, which I think we can all concur with, many thanks to the panelists for their excellent presentations. And he says, what's most striking is how the Democrats seem to have missed something of a unique opportunity. Little progress was made on several fronts of their agenda because of internal disputes. What does that tell us about short-termism in politics, not just among people called populists? So I would like to not only pose that question, but follow up with a parallel question, which is, how serious are those divisions among Democrats objectively? I mean, in terms of stalling the president's agenda, and how serious are they optically in terms of giving the impression to the American public that the forward movement that characterized the early Biden months has been lost? And maybe each of the four panelists could give their views on that succinctly, starting with, because I think that Elaine's had to leave us, starting with Dave.
Part of the challenge, and again, this goes back to what I was describing, the base versus the sort of political center that elected you. I mean, it's a 50-50 Senate, and Nancy Pelosi is managing the smallest majority in recent times, right? When you're talking 5 votes, that's just a small contingency of your conference. So you're not negotiating simply with your broad majority. You're negotiating with each individual person in the Senate. Democrats need each senator to vote with them so they can get to the tie, so they can get Harris to break the tie. Okay, so what the demand was on this situation was, we want these massive restructural changes passed. It's going to change everything, right? Sorry, you didn't have the majority coalition in place to be able to do that. You had to be realistic with who was elected and what policies you were going to pursue. They were not. The only example of that where they actually worked it through was the infrastructure bill, where you got 19 Republicans, including Mitch McConnell, to vote for it. They didn't work through the process of building a majority coalition. And by the way they've approached that, it hasn't been just simply at a legislative level that they've struggled. Like I said before, his job approval with independents is 26 to 64. Right, so he doesn't even have his majority coalition. Biden doesn't have his majority coalition intact that elected him. This is not unusual, like I said before, with presidents in terms of where they have this base versus how do I sustain my majority coalition. But I would have to say the expectations that he could even come close to that with a 50-50 Senate was, that was not political reality. Now, having said that, to your point, there have been repercussions because they sold the, yes, we could do this. And so now they look like they can't accomplish things. And that gets to the issue of competence and ability to get things through, and it's hurt them. When you have a 50-50 Senate, I mean, the country didn't decisively go one direction, how can you then at a policy level derive that scale of change? And they just didn't think through that.
Thank you, Dave. Over to Leslie.
Yeah, I mean, I guess clearly I agree with what's just been said. I think that it's clearly a problem optically, but I guess I would take a step back and say that this is demonstrative of some really deep divisions across the United States. And my concern, and I would say that, I agree and support many of the progressive values in the Democratic Party, but politically, I come out as a pragmatist. And I think that I grew up in the Midwest and am in very close touch with many who would like to be Democrat, do not wish to be Republican, but simply can't go that direction because the Democratic Party looks, A, like it's internally divided, and B, the progressive wing is just too far away from those moderates that now feel they don't have a party. So I think the optics are very difficult, but there's a reality. It's not just a political game. We all know it's not just a political game, but there is a deep reality that this reflects, and what I haven't seen amongst the leadership of any political party is a strategy for actually doing the really hard work at the local level across very, very different communities of building those bridges. And I don't think there's any easy way around it other than just really actively engaging across communities to try and forge a new way of thinking about politics and of thinking about, how the other half lives.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Jakob?
No, I mean, I don't have much to add other than, I basically agree with what Dave said in the beginning. I mean, in a European sort of multi-party system sense, the Democratic Party is not a party, right? I mean, it's a majority coalition of several parties. And Joe Manchin is that in one particular end of that coalition government, if you like. And the liberal wing is in another one, and they squabble, and they are unable to agree on anything at this very moment, at least. And there's very little that the liberals can do to put political pressure on Joe Manchin, who's elected, in a heavily Republican state, and he's not on the ballot until 4 years from, maybe 2 years from now. So he's completely safe. And in the end, all the liberals in the House of Representatives who are going to be losing their majority are probably going to have to give him something, or basically take whatever he wants, even if it's a much smaller package. But in a European sense, the Democratic Party is a coalition unraveling. It's a majority coalition unraveling. It's not a party.
Thank you for that perspective. Over to Bruce.
To Dave's point, I mean, I think you're right that if you look at the outcome of the last election, it's not, and especially in the Congress, it's not at all clear that the Democrats had a mandate for the kind of things that they then proposed. I would remind listeners that George W. Bush won the 2000 election by probably about 500 votes in Florida. And he claimed he had a mandate for enormous change, huge tax cuts, et cetera, et cetera. So the question is whether you can deliver on that mandate. George W. Bush did deliver on that huge tax cut. Biden has delivered on a huge stimulus package. He's delivered on an infrastructure bill, which I would remind people Donald Trump promised to do multiple times and never did. That said and done, I think Jacob's right, that what we see here is the fact that we have a two-party system that is not very functional anymore, especially in the Democratic Party, where you have this kind of factions of the Democratic Party. And as you said, Anthony, it's also an optics thing. And optics are important because we live in an information environment which is more polarized than it's ever been in our history. So that, look, I used to be a journalist, and bad news sells and good news doesn't sell. So journalists like to write about conflict and basically feed that conflict by writing about it. You know, if I were a progressive in the House of Representatives, and I would classify myself as a progressive as a voter, I would say, look, we proposed first a $6 trillion stimulus package. We then cut it in half, and then we agreed to cut it in half again. And two senators in the Democratic senators in the Senate, we think, are not negotiating in good faith because they can't take yes for an answer. And I think that's one of the problems. We have no party discipline in the United States. Each senator or congressman or congresswoman is an independent actor who raises their own money and goes their own way. And that's a fundamental flaw of our system, which makes it harder and harder to get stuff done. And I think that is going to be a problem going forward, no matter who controls the Senate in the future or the House.
Well, thank you everybody for what's really been an absolutely fascinating discussion. And we're going to go over to Washington, D.C., where Joe Dunn, who heads up the EP's small liaison office to the US Congress and indeed the wider political system, is going to round off with some closing remarks. And I'm actually going to ask him if he could try and incorporate in this another question that did come in from Jan Baverstrom, which was how easy would it be for our own office in Washington to liaise successfully with a potential future Republican majority in Congress? Over to you, Joe.
Yes, thank you very much, Anthony, and thank you for inviting me to this fascinating and very interesting discussion, as well as giving me the impossible task of wrapping up in a way that will do justice to what Elaine, Fran, Leslie, Bruce, and Jacob and Dave have said. I would say what we've heard today is really a story of disappointed expectations. A presidency that started with sort of great ambition and optimism. I mean, I think Elaine and Dave spoke about this. I mean, I can vividly remember the Biden speech. I think it was in Pittsburgh, presenting the American Jobs Plan for 1.9 trillion, the American Families Plan for 3.5 trillion, saying he was going to build a fair economy. We were going to have a once-in-a-generation investment. It was the stimulus, the promise of societal change. But then, as Elaine and Dave was just saying, you can't have a revolution with narrow majorities. And, you know, he's been terribly damaged by the implementation failure, which will probably carry over into next year. So this sort of legislative collapse, maybe it's partly bad luck. Jacob and Bruce were talking about the inflation that came about as a result of the stimulus. Perhaps the rise in the trade deficit will be very damaging. Elaine pointed out how the impact of Biden's own miscalculations, the Afghan withdrawal was probably badly judged. The strife, the intra-party strife in the Democratic Party has you know, cost him. I would add myself the failure on voting rights, possibly also a miscalculation or political miscalculation. And then Bruce and Dave also described, I think, the effectiveness of the strategic opposition by the Republican Party, some damage by sort of constant media coverage, constantly sniping and basically questioning the competence of the administration. And I think Dave hinted also at some structural elements in the filibuster and the fact that the two senators, Manchin and Sinema, could effectively totally block the legislative agenda. So this is all going to carry over into the second year. I don't think the panel talked too much about the midterms, but it was clear from what Bruce and Dave and others said was that the Youngkin election in Virginia was a kind of template. I think Bruce said we could expect a typical loss of 43 seats in such a situation. And I noticed that the probable future speaker, McCarthy, said at the weekend, he said that 70 seats held by Democrats were in play in his view. So that would be sort of a massive change in the majority in the House. So I think all this brings us to the gridlock in the Senate, and in the House and in the entire sort of US system. I think possibly the most important long-term strategic challenge was mentioned particularly by Leslie and also by Bruce and Elaine. The threat to American democracy and the challenge, the battle between democracy and autocracy. I think Biden himself said it very pointedly in one of his last major speeches, basically presenting himself as the last bulwark between democracy and a possible autocratic system in the US. So this is obviously worrying for Europe. I'm thankful to Fran and also to Bruce for bringing the discussion back to the area of transatlantic relations. Fran pressed a number of, I think, red lights on the Europe's march towards regulating the tech sector. Bruce mentioned how can the US sustain its interest in the TTC, the Trade and Technology Council, which is one of the main gains in the transatlantic relationship in recent times. And Fran saw, I hope wrongly, certainly a lot of consultation and conflict, and Jacob and Leslie were also justifiably seeing big problems ahead in terms of climate change and the CBAM and so on. So I say that for this shows how important it is to keep the bridges, keep the legislative dialogue going. EPLO will do everything it can to play a part in that. We build bridges every day. We link the two houses as much as we can, and I hope that through legislative dialogue we can manage some transatlantic harmony in these all-important areas of tech, trade, and climate change. So I think I'd stop it there, Anthony. Hope that was short enough for you. Thank you all for this fantastic discussion.
Thank you, Joe. And thank you to all of our panelists and speakers this afternoon here in Brussels, to not only Joe joining us from the United States, but also the majority of our panelists doing so. Thanks to Bruce, to Dave, to Elaine, to Fran, to Jakob, and to Leslie. It's been a great discussion. We'll be coming back to this theme later in the year as the midterm elections approach, but I think this has been a great scene setter for the politics of 2022. And for those of you interested in this subject, I'd just like to draw your attention to this publication from EPRS. It's called the US Congress, Facts and Figures. We produce it once every 2 years, and we produced the most recent one back in October 2021, and it has a myriad of interesting material in it. And for example, that page there, if you can see it clearly, shows the changing fortunes of the two parties in terms of the composition of Congress in successive 2-year terms. And there's a terrific sort of aide-memoire and briefing document, particularly for members and staffers who might be going over to Washington, DC. It provides a real fantastic kind of tour d'horizon of the way that the US Congress functions and its political makeup and its political history. So I hope as many of you as possible will also take the opportunity to download from the Parliament's website, United States Congress Facts and Figures by EPRS. This brings us to the end of the second EPRS Policy Roundtable of the year so far, and the third one is coming up soon. It'll be on Wednesday. It's entitled How to Stress Test EU Policies, Building a More Resilient Europe for Tomorrow. And it looks at the question of how in advance of policies being adopted and also after policies have been adopted and they're being put into practice to try and make EU policies more resilient in the kind of complicated and challenging world which we all face. And one component of that are the uncertainties on the geopolitical scene, and we've looked at them indirectly through the prism of what's happening in American politics, but they can be looked at through many prisms, and we'll be doing that hopefully during the course of this coming year. So once again, a big thank you to our panelists and also to the audience who've stayed the course, to quote the phrase that Dave invoked, and looking forward, hoping anyway, that as many of you as possible have a very agreeable afternoon and evening wherever you are, and that you'll join us on future occasions for these EPRS policy roundtables. Thank you very much indeed, everybody, and goodbye.